Okay, so I've prepped everyone that we're going to go somewhat on book and then somewhat off book, but I will start with one of the questions that we talked about in advance just to get everyone started. And you're thinking of your Slido questions, I'm sure. So maybe everyone, and this is the thing, this is a really important context setter because we didn't do huge long bios, but in this question, I'm going to ask everyone to give a couple minutes in response here. So we're talking about the role of employers and how they engage with employees. So for each of you, because you do have very unique and different perspectives, how has the relationship between employers and employees changed from your perspective in the last 5 years? And maybe we can just go down the line.
Sure. So first off, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. And I was assured there would be an asterisk next to employers with a link saying platforms.
Platforms.
It's
in my notes. I just didn't say it.
Yeah,
sorry.
All good. It's all good. But great to be here. When we think about the changing world of work, it's my day job. It's something I think about a lot. With more than 4 million people around the world who use Uber as a way of earning a living that fits around their life, it's something we think about a lot. I think it's important to take a step back and remember that just about 0.5% of the global workforce use digital apps like Uber to find work, that this isn't a trend that's sort of taking over. I think there was a moment, a bit like some of the hype cycle that's been talked about around automation, that independent contracting and gig work was sort of dominating the economy and taking over. And that's kind of been walked back a bit now. You saw sort of Larry Katz and Alan Kruger sort of pull back some of their research where they'd previously sort of talked about massive increases. You saw the BLS have actually said independent contracting in the US has gone down in recent years. So I think it's important to have a bit of context there. I think it's really important to think about, we think about a lot about access to work and flexibility in work. We think those are some of the reasons why people choose to drive with companies like Uber. The ability to sort of start work and often on the same day have money in your bank account and then work in a way sort of start, stop at the touch of a button delivers real value. But that we need to recognize that there are real challenges that come with independent contracting, that being self-employed is tough, that there is a patchier social safety net that, as Ethan sort of spoke about earlier, the social safety net that was designed sort of post-Second World War is no longer, does need modernization. And if we start moving away from thinking about employer to think about worker-based portable benefits, that's something I think we definitely support and want to get behind and are looking to do more in that area. So I will stop there and say
the audience will kill me if I don't mention. This morning there was a lot of talk about the role for organized labor, and Uber came up a couple of times in terms of that, and not just Uber, but these platforms that provide an access to jobs. I'm not going to ask you to speak specifically to what's happening in Toronto today, but do you guys, what would your response be in saying how are you then going to protect those workers, whether we want to call them gig economy workers or disruptive workers, whatever we want, whatever term we all agree on? What is the response to that question when you get it?
So I think there's a few things. I think first off, there's a really interesting one about what does it mean to have voice and worker voice in the 21st century and in the gig economy? What does it mean for sort of someone who does a few hours a week on a platform to be able to have their voice heard? And I think it's on us to do a better job of listening. And I think there are a wide range of sort of innovative responses from coworker.org to Facebook groups to WhatsApp groups and others that are emerging to try and organize and give voice to workers. And I think we as a platform need to sort of continue to listen and find new ways of engaging. On protections generally, we recognize there are gaps and we want to do more. In Europe today, if you drive on Uber and you have an accident and you have medical expenses, we have an insurance that we cover that. If you have a child, you get 1,500 euros in your bank account to take some time off to spend with your new child. In the US, if you've done more than 3,000 trips, we'll pay for you or a loved one to get a degree from Arizona State University online. As in, there are things we're doing and trying to go further on benefits and protections. I think many times we run up against this perverse incentive in employment law that says that the more you do to provide benefits and protections to workers, then they have to be employees. And then if once you're in that world, you lose a lot of the flexibility that workers say they want. So our whole message is we want to improve the quality of work, but it should be a debate around high quality and low quality work, not necessarily a debate around independent contracting versus employment, because we all know that in employment as well, there's a whole lot of really pretty low quality work where workers aren't empowered, where so-called flexible work means you end up doing clopen shifts, how you have on-call scheduling, you have really pretty poor working conditions and a lack of benefits in employment as well. So,
thanks. Okay, awesome. Linda.
Yeah, sure. So just maybe by way of a bit of context, I had a Canadian distribution strategy for TD. the Canadian Personal Bank, and my main focus right now is branch transformation, which we call Future Ready. But TD employs 85,000 people globally, largely in North America. We've been around for 160 years, and I think we've always been in a constant cycle of change. It might have been longer, and maybe it's now 3 to 5 years, but we've had to evolve all the way through that time period. What I can tell you is 1 in 2 of our employees right now is going through some sort of transformation depending on the business they're in. So that tells you how we have to think about change and change leadership and setting people up for success as we go through those transformations. And 20,000 of our colleagues have probably had a change in opportunity or role just in the last 12 months. The piece that I'm very focused on, Future Ready, is anchored in what have our customers told us and what are our colleagues telling us. And so you have to have the right sources of data and research and input and listening and kind of, eyeball to eyeball with your customers and your colleagues, because your colleagues know it better than you from the towers, as we like to say. Future Ready itself is very much anchored on how do we increase confidence. And we know that 78% of Canadians are not financially confident, therefore that impacts a whole bunch of things in your life. In order to increase confidence of our customers, we have to increase the confidence of our colleagues if we're going to truly elevate advice and meet more customer needs. And so we're very much anchored in what are the coaching programs we need, what are the completely revamped best-in-class training programs we need to do that. How do we ensure that we have the right tools and the right systems to make that easy for our colleagues and our customers? And then how do we ensure that we have the right measures to bring it all together? And so I think what's unique to our transformation is we're approaching it from an investment. And many other organizations that don't do this quite as well, they approach it from an expense or cost-cutting exercise. And so I think it's important to figure out what matters to your colleagues and how can you ensure that you're making the right investments so that they will continue to be successful, because I think the change cycle really is shortening in today's world.
Thanks. Chief?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in the home territory, traditional territory of the Mississauga New Credits, and as an Ojibwe person, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize that from the beginning. The question, where we are going as First Nation people, particularly within the Anishinabek Nation, is we're institutional developing. We have just recently begun our own child welfare law, which will mean that for many of us that have fought against child welfare and the way it was apprehended our children, the 60 scoop and so on, we promised we wouldn't let that happen again. So what we have to do is develop our own institutions, our own self-government, our governance of institutions. That means for us is that we have to have a higher learning institution, and we are now on the path of developing our own standalone education institution in order to not only meet the social and needs of our communities through education and child welfare and home care and all of those things to develop our communities, but we have just recently launched a program where we are now meeting directly with industry. And I was interested in listening to the former speaker where he was talking about two paths. Well, really, that's where we're on. We're on a path of developing professionals in order to develop our own institutions within our communities and within our First Nations. But on the other side of the coin, we're going to meet directly with industry. And we've targeted 3 major industries. Bruce Nuclear, who has a 30-year work plan. We've targeted Ontario Hydro, who is going to have a tremendous amount of development that's going to occur in Northern Ontario if you want to get to the Ring of Fire. And the third one is that we're going to be looking at union gas. And those are more traditional kinds of jobs, well-paying, stable jobs that we need in order to build our communities. You have to recognize that 60% of our community population is somewhere in the cities. And we have to reach out to that to those people. But it would be interesting to note for the audience here that our last graduation, which was held a ceremony, our graduation ceremonies were held in London, Ontario, close to my First Nation, that out of the 20 nurses that we had graduate, there were 2 non-First Nation people that joined our course. And so we're attracting more and more non-First Nation people because what we do is we put a traditional emphasis on the core values of people rather than the institutional value. And employers are more and more, both from governmental level, institutional levels like banking, policing, are now recognizing more and more that in order to sustain a valuable workforce within their organizations, particularly with First Nations, they begin now to recognize the value that First Nation people bring with them through their teachings and through their tradition. And what we're trying to do is embrace that more, institutionalize that more, have more non-First Nation people come into our institutions to learn more about us, so when they go back out, they have a much deeper understanding of our culture and our commitment to our people and to our communities and, of course, to Canada.
That's great, thank you. Danielle.
Thank you very much. And this, I'm curious also to learn more about what you were describing. So in some ways, I've observed, which I will build on Linda's comments, 2 trends with companies or employers. One are companies like TD that recognize that people are a primary asset in their business and that there is essentially lost productivity when people aren't maximized. And that was reflected in the talk that we saw earlier by John, who really talked about sort of the future of work and business and innovation, and the way that kind of talent is core to that. So companies that see both due to a tight labor market, that there is an advantage, a tight labor market to be competitive, to attract and retain people, but also really to innovate and grow their businesses, that investing in people in the workplace and through skills training and upgrading is a key component of that. And I'd say another camp of another trend with which some companies fall, where there's a feeling that they can't find workers. I'm going to just say it as I hear it, that people are lazy and they don't want to work. And they feel very frustrated and they don't know what to do. They know that people are a core part of their business in order to really be sustained and grow. Like, we increasingly hear that companies are at risk of losing business in Ontario because they actually can't find the people to operate. But yet there's this disconnect in terms of where the people are who are looking for jobs and companies who offer those jobs. And to some degree, I would say it's in that framework. And then in terms of folks, particularly my focus of work, and I should say that I'm no longer with the Hospitality Workers Training Center I miss them. So just in terms of the slide that you see up there, I'm doing research partially with the Metcalf Foundation, which is what Val said earlier. But my focus, should stop hitting that too, for the last several years has been in looking at sort of policies and practices and programs that best serve people who are at the social and economic margins, to get into jobs and to build careers, to have economic mobility and sustainability. And when you talk to folks who are really struggling in our labor market and in our community, they certainly want to work. They don't know where to go. So there's really a disconnect between where those jobs are and the people who are able to do them. And I would say in terms of a trend, that we increasingly, for a variety of reasons, our businesses and processes have become very we focus on managing risk through our process. And the hiring process, I would say, is reflective of that. And certainly companies are doing very innovative things. Accenture is another one that has their own in-house apprenticeship program. So there's lots of great things happening in the ilk of what Linda described at TD. But the other, and I'd say the trend has been happening for much more than 5 years, that our increasing reliance on online platforms that are exclusively job matching and a much more transactional approach to finding talent is actually exacerbating a gap between folks who don't have the social connections and the credentials to automatically be screened in through those processes.
That's really interesting. I'm going to divide this up a bit, and I'm already going off script, but for Guy, we say Guy because it's French, but it's Guy and Linda. Anyone out there who was counting when I rambled off my 5 learnings would have known I only said 4 because I was trying to be in a rush. The 5th one that I didn't say was around a term that Karen Myers used, which is mid-career learners, as opposed to we all talk about mid-career workers. So I would ask for the 2 company people, in terms of, we heard it this morning, companies don't care about their employees. They'll just, so in your response, what is a specific example maybe that you could each point out of how you are supporting your mid-career learners? And I'll come back to
Sure. So I think we noticed that people were often turning to Uber at times of transition in their lives. They joined when they were laid off, when they wanted to retrain, when they wanted to start a business, when they were doing something else. It varies by country depending on how hard it is to get started as a driver, but oftentimes people start because they want to get somewhere else. It's not that they're committing to being a professional driver for the rest of their lives, they're doing it as a stepping stone to something. And we wanted to see what we could do to turbocharge that. And actually last year, our mission statement was rewritten, and it's now to ignite opportunity. And so sort of opportunity has become a really important word within Uber. And so last year, I was really proud to have worked on a project where we've partnered with Arizona State University Online, who are one of the US's leading online education providers. I think they came top of news reports, sort of most innovative colleges above sort of Stanford and MIT and others, to introduce a program for our partner drivers and their families. So it's modeled partly off Starbucks' college achievement plan, where they provide sort of tuition assistance for baristas, where we went one step further and said, for any driver it's now in most of the US, not all the US, who's done more than 3,000 trips, we will fully fund for you to take college degree courses or certificate courses with ASU Online. And not only that, if you don't want to do it yourself, you can pass it on to a dependent. So you can pass it on to a spouse, a child, a sibling, whoever it is. And so I think this is a real signal of intent from Uber that we do believe in sort of in opportunity and do believe in helping adult learners, because sort of by definition, everyone driving on Uber is an adult, and they're people who have aspirations and ambitions that may go well beyond Uber, and we want to help them get to where they're going on and off the road, not to be too corny.
I just got it. Okay, Linda.
Yeah, I get it. Coincidentally, I have a survey that I was just reading that relates to your point. So we just surveyed 8,000 of our colleagues. And so 90% of them said they're willing to invest the time and energy to learn new skills as their jobs change. And the other thing that came out of it is 92% of colleagues want to work for a company that demonstrates through its investment that it cares about them having a long-term career. And so colleagues want a career, not just a job. The other thing that was interesting in this is the emotions they mentioned around this very topic were like interested, excited, and encouraged. And if you were to sub out one of those words for our US colleagues, they added joy. And so I think clearly it's incredibly important as a company that you think about what your vision is, your mission, your purpose. People want to work for purpose-driven organizations, and you can't do that just by words on a page. You have to bring that to life in the investment in your colleagues and your customers, and the leaders of the organization have to demonstrate that through their actions. Maybe one specific case I'll share. About 3 years ago, 2016, we weren't leveraging innovative automation or digital workers, you might think about it. And so we landed at that point in time on a very small use case, and we repointed 3 colleagues towards it. And these were colleagues that were mature in their career, who were prepared to get the certification on the platform that we were going to do, completely external to TD. And we had about 30 processes that we then put through innovative automation. Today, we have more than 400 digital workers versus the 30 that we had 3 years ago. And the processes that those digital workers, who can work 24/7, obviously, digital workers, kind of cute for computers with fancy software, the processes they do is up 300%. Now, this could be a tough sell for existing employees who might have done some of those routine tasks, like processing transactions or changes to your account or so on. But what we were able to do with the hundreds of employees that would have been doing those is repoint them to more meaningful work and upskill them. For example, if you had the death of a loved one and you wanted to call into our estate center of expertise, we retrained some of those workers there. And so I think it is important, linked to this notion of purpose, as you automate, as you innovate, how do you take those workers, those colleagues who want to add meaning and have purpose, and how do you skill them to be able to do that?
Right. Yeah, that's the question. And I'm going to ask my next question down to Chief and to Danielle. So we talked all morning about the need to collaborate, and this is not a solution that a single group can solve, and it's related to one of the Slido questions here, outside of your organization, whose job is this whole thing anyway? And so we heard from government and institutions, and I mean, of course the answer is all of us working together, and as an organization who is collaboration and convening and building partnerships at its core, I know how hard that actually is in practice, and I'm wondering from your perspective, so for example, when you reached out initially to industry to build those partnerships, if you could talk a little bit about the process, because we can all sit here and say more collaboration and partnerships, the how to go from that to, and now we have a specific partnership with 3 industry, that's the hard part. And any comments too from anyone about whose job it is and what specific role the employers should be playing. Because I'll just say if employers came in and did invest a ton of money and said to their employees, but you must use it only to do the following 3 things, there would also be a backlash to that and saying, well, you can't tell me what to do. So I feel like we're in this position where we're working in that weird middle ground. And so I'd be really interested to hear from both your perspectives, kind of how do we play nice together, and what specific role can employers take on that is appropriate?
For sure. So I don't think that there's a ceiling in the role that employers can take on. Like companies, businesses that see this as a competitive advantage are leading it. It's in their DNA. When you talk to companies, and I think TD is an example of this, that are really good at it, they don't have a workforce problem. They actually don't have a problem finding talent, even in small communities where there legitimately there's a real shortage of people. So I wouldn't say that there's like a finite role or a narrow role for companies. Certainly leading, not even leading by example, but like developing in-house programs. So some of the work that Linda described, Karen earlier mentioned career pathways. Some companies will map out like their own internal progression pathways. So in some cases, that's training that somebody can do in an institution or in-house, depending on their business, but that progress is acknowledged and rewarded, both in terms of responsibility and income. So, and when somebody knows what that pathway is when they start, the data shows that their retention is greater and their loyalty to that company is greater. In terms of the role of business in the broader system, and I think the work that BHER does is also a good example of this. We have a largely publicly funded education and training system, which to varying degrees is working in partnership with business. And not necessarily to the fault of any institution, but there's an opportunity to close that gap and to build our local muscle and capacity in Ontario and Canada to kind of build on some of the examples. Sarah from Brookfield mentioned a case study where training was done to support kind of short-term reskilling, and similar to the work I think that GM's doing now. We have an opportunity to build that capacity and to use the resources that we have in the current system to test and then scale those models. And business has a good carrot. So it's hard for an institution with credibility or integrity to say no when business says this is our need. So although it takes some internal capacity and recognizing that companies are very focused on their business, which is not necessarily HR, to dedicate some capacity to have a plan in terms of what is the vision for people development within a company, and then to build those partnerships and put a bit of pressure on the broader system to kind of align with the needs of business.
So thank you again for the question. We see it from slightly a different perspective. Many of our communities are in semi-rural or perhaps even in isolated areas, and so employment in those locations is very, very limited. And consequently, we have a large migration that comes out of those communities relatively unskilled. our direction really has been to create partnerships with industry, create partnerships where in fact we have something that they don't have to offer. And what we offer is an institution that can be very flexible and nimble and give accreditation at a university or at a college level. I've been through some of the proposals that universities go through in order to establish a course that takes literally years to get it accredited. In our case, what we have is an act of the province of Ontario called the Indigenous Institutes Act that actually we become the masters of our own house. We can tailor-make training and accreditation to industry standards without going through tendering exercise and accreditation exercises and all of that. That can be done with small companies, medium-sized companies, big companies. It doesn't matter to us, the size of the company. We want to know what your needs are. And then in turn, we will work in collaboration with those companies to build that kind of A-level platform performance so that we can continuously not only infuse people, and it's not just Aboriginal people, all people, into the workforce, but at the same time to continue the retraining process as it goes along and as technology changes and as things change. We find that, you know, training in the normal institutional capacity setting now, people are taking credits for no reason outside of getting the diploma. They don't mean anything to people. Why are we doing this? Why are we spending, I went through university, I took a bunch of crap that I never used in my life, nor ever intend to, right? So why are we subjecting our youth or our middle-aged people are coming back for training to that kind of system? Why not give them something that they can use hands-on and go back to work or increase the value of their performance with their employers? It makes no sense to us to have to run the gamut that somebody else set out that makes no sense in the marketplace today.
And it goes to Linda's point about if the cycle is shortening, then the need to get people the right skills and in the right way needs to be balanced with the needs on the business side. So there's a Slido question here. I know how exciting labor productivity is, and we can talk about it or not, but the point of the question here is that health and quality of life is the really important contributor to labor productivity. And so I guess the question that's stated here is what can and should employers be doing to help their employees on that? And I guess the caveat that I would ask, because I'm the moderator up here, is how do you find the balance between what the employers should be doing or can be doing to directly support the work of the workers, and then those those mental health supports and leave supports and the other things related to maintain, employers only have so much capacity. So I'd be interested to know what you're doing, if you have an interesting example, or how you make the decision to balance a limited amount of money that you want to put to maintain the most productive and healthy workforce that you can. And maybe we'll start here and we could go right down the line on that one.
Sure. As self-employed independent contractors, drivers tend to be responsible and couriers tend to be responsible for their own healthcare. Systems vary around the world, obviously, and where I grew up in the UK, it's all easy, it's sorted. You've got the National Health System, National Health Service that just takes care of it, and universal provision is the most portable benefit of all, I sometimes say. In places like the US, it's much tougher, and we work with partners like Stride Health to help people enroll in the best sort of ACA plan that they can. I see there's another question about benefits in Canada, and I'm afraid Uber's in 63 countries, and I don't know the details of all of them, but in Canada, I believe most of our protections are focused on trip. So as in, if you have an accident on trip, you get then the medical expenses, you get the sort of loss of income, you get the survivor benefits, those sorts of things. I'm really keen to push into more off-trip things, as I mentioned in Europe, around maternity, paternity, jury service, those sorts of things. I think the final just point I'll note on sort of health and more well-being is we recently did worked with sort of Carl Benedict Frey and Thor Berger, and Carl Frey has come up earlier in the automation debate. He's an economist at the Oxford Martin School. But we looked at well-being among drivers in London, because there's an increasing literature around social, sort of subjective well-being as an important factor, and should you monitor well-being rather than GDP and all of that. And thankfully, the UK National Statistics have their own well-being sort of instruments and metrics. And so what we did was use the same survey instrument and survey Uber drivers. And the sort of slightly counterintuitive finding was that even if you adjust for income, even if you adjust for demographics, even if you adjust for everything else, drivers on Uber said that they were happier and had some more worthwhile lives than the sort of other cohorts, but had higher levels of anxiety. And so sort of there's a trade-off here. And I think it's an important trade-off to recognize, and one that we want to help grapple with by filling some of those gaps in those social protections that I mentioned.
Sure. So
Of those distortions.
I think TD does a pretty terrific job of providing pretty robust benefits across the spectrum to employees with lots of choice unique to their circumstance. I think the angle of health and wellness that I think we could all focus on is financial wellness and financial health. And obviously the stat I shared earlier is an example of that. Prior to us putting a vice president in charge of financial literacy and education at TD, I was the volunteer chair. And so it's a subject I feel really passionate about, and I know there's some folks in the audience that do as well. You know, the fact is 7 out of 10 Canadians are not comfortable in their math and numeracy skills to make good decisions. 90% of Canadians are making less than 88K. The average is about 44K. You know, things like interest on credit cards or saving or living paycheck to paycheck. You'd, I think, be surprised if you saw some of the stats, even in the 100+ K per year category. So for me, financial wellness as part of a wellness program is often something that organizations, the school system overlooks. And I think it is one of the largest contributors to folks' stress. And when you're not comfortable in your financial wellness, it's hard for you to be comfortable in any other aspect of your life. And so I do think organizations, government, education in particular, could do a better job in Canada in helping people be more comfortable, and that would translate in many other ways.
And the chief is so, I don't know, hospitable, but so one, just the program that was described, the Indigenous Institutes, is phenomenal, and if you're not familiar with it, I would learn more about it. I would consider it a best practice. And to the question, I mean, some of the examples, particularly for lower wage workers, where there's a lot of precarity and folks who are working sometimes 40 hours and still living in poverty, a practice that's been adopted sometimes when the private sector kind of comes together with a third party that's trying to aggregate and design workforce solutions, is to have some level of peer-based support or like direct support for workers where they can also kind of feed into like what's actually going on. So one case in a community that had poor transportation, everybody was late for work. Well, the bus got there basically 15 minutes after the shift started. So learning about, and this is different from wellness, but it's the broader sort of quality of life and dynamic in the workplace. Another example for large institutions that had tuition reimbursement, the workers couldn't afford to front load the cost of the training. So in actually talking to them and figuring out like what are the impediments to participating in the upskilling, where they were actually trying to create these sort of these upward moves, supporting, like paying for the training on the front end, increase that access. So like having dialogue with the workforce and really trying to inculcate that in practice as well.
That's great.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I would give the last word to Chief. Do you have, like, in terms of the takeaways and the way that we can learn how to better support our workers, but our broader communities as we all grapple with this disruption and the anxiety that it causes, to come back to that question around health? There's a lot that we can learn. Is there anything that you would like to finish and leave with in terms of something that we can take away and try to incorporate when we get back to our busy lives?
So what our schooling is trying to do right from our babies on up and into post-secondary school is to create this sense of better mental health and peering with people, so that we teach tradition right from the very beginning, so that people become comfortable in their own skin. People of my generation were shunned and basically would not be involved with a lot of social activities of my peer. And it was even worse the generation before that came up. So what we're putting a lot of emphasis on with our youth and within our post-secondary school is that we want to have people that, first of all, become comfortable with who they are as an Aboriginal person in this country and not have to feel ashamed of the history. The second thing is that realize that you're going to be out in a big world where there's not going to be a lot of Aboriginal people. You have to be able to be strong enough to carry on with your mission in life and see the best you can see. And so it's not just formal education, but it's also mental health, and it's also cultural training, and it's also an appreciation of really the world we live in. So you can take those kind of healthy breaks by not necessarily walking the street on Yonge Street, but there is some parks around. You can smudge every morning. You can give blessing every day. Those things don't cost anything. It's what you can do for yourself.
I can't think of a better way to end this panel, so I would like to thank the panelists, and I would like to thank you for listening and encourage everyone to also give a round of applause.